Is federalism the answer to the war in Syria? The idea has been floated as the government and opposition prepare for yet another round of talks. But with each side entrenched in its position, can these talks yield any results? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. Yet another round of Syria talks begins in Geneva on Monday as we mark the 5-year anniversary of the civil war. And after talks earlier this year failed, UN envoy Staffan de Mistura is hoping these negotiations will go more smoothly. Both sides have confirmed they will attend, and the idea of federalism is being talked about as one potential solution. Which might make sense when you take a look at this map. Syria is clearly divided, with no one group holding a majority of the countries. And if the parties agree to federalism, then the lines practically draw themselves. Here we have Syria's Kurdish people. They hold this territory here in blue, and they've already agreed to consider the idea. Kurdish leader Salam Muslim said, "What you call it isn't important. We have said over and over again that we want a decentralised Syria. Call it administrations, call it federalism. Everything is possible." Now, President Bashar al-Assad has also indicated that he might be open to federalism. Right now, his troops hold less than 20% of the country. There you can see it in orange. In an interview last September, he said that if the Syrian people support federalism, then he will support it too.
If there are certain groups or sections in Syria which have demands, they should be tabled within the national framework and in dialogue with Syrian political forces. When the Syrian people agree on taking steps of this kind, which have to do with federalism, autonomy, decentralisation, or changing the whole political system, this needs to be agreed upon by the Syrian people, and consequently amend the constitution. This is why these groups need to convince the Syrian people of their proposals. In that respect, they're not in dialogue with the state, but rather with the people. When the Syrian people decide to move in a certain direction and to take a certain step, we will naturally approve it.
But it's Syria's opposition groups that are firmly against the proposal. Their territory is scattered along Syria's western coastline, and in some areas it competes with al-Nusra Front and ISIL. The Syrian opposition coordinator has said, "We have agreed we will expand a non-central government in a future Syria, but not any kind of federalism or division." So plenty to talk about, and we'll examine this idea of federalism and then take a look at whether Geneva III will even get around to addressing this issue. And our guests today to help us do this, here with me in the studio, is Marwan Kabalan, Syrian academic and writer and associate analyst at the Doha Institute. In Beirut, Maha Yahya, acting director of the Carnegie Middle East Centre. And in London, Julien Barnes-Dacey, Senior Policy Fellow in the Middle East and North Africa Programme at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome to all of you. Julien, first of all to you, because you raised this idea of federalism last week on this show, on Inside Story. How do you think it would work? What might a federal Syria look like?
Well, I think it's the only option on the table today, which is effectively devolving, decentralizing powers away from Damascus in some capacity, giving the regime authority over the areas it controls, but effectively granting autonomy, local rule to rebel-held areas and putting an end to the sieges and the attempts to wrest back control of them. So it's a loose model that tries to keep the country together. It concedes the fact that there won't be a strong central state going forward, that there's no chance of a deal between the sides that would mean a unitary government. But it also is an attempt to try and warn off the danger of Syria breaking up. And I think it's the only thing that could possibly give a model that holds the country together, gives enough of the different sides enough of an incentive to move forward with some kind of political process.
Do you see it being divided along the lines into territories that different players in the war currently hold? Or do you see it being divided more along sectarian, ethnic lines?
No, I think the short-term ambition should probably be a recognition of the de facto situation on the ground, which is a mix of different authorities across the country. I don't think one wants to start thinking in sectarian terms. And I think even the term federalization is probably dangerous because it suggests that you can easily carve the country up, which you can't. I mean, if you just look at Damascus, the regime controls the central bit, but there are areas in the suburbs controlled by the rebels. And federalization wouldn't really concede to that kind of division of power. So I think it's more about devolving power, decentralizing power, allowing the rebels autonomous control of the zones that they already control, and conceding that it will be very mixed.
Maha, call it federalism, call it decentralization of power, devolving of power. Do you agree that this is the only option on the table?
Well, it depends on what shape it takes. I'm not sure that it's the only option, because if you go down that road, I mean, what do you do with with ISIS, for example? Do you say you're going to enter into a federal system with ISIS? What about Jabhat al-Nusra? I mean, the division even of the areas under rebel hands or under non-state actors on the ground is very mixed. So I'm not quite certain how this kind of a federal system would evolve in this particular context. Furthermore, if we're going to talk about a federal system with clear sectarian and ethnic divisions, this is a recipe for disaster, and it's going to sow the seeds of conflict for a very long time to come. When federalism has been brought up in the last few weeks, it's been very much in the context of a national dialogue, of a national discussion, but it's not clear, again, who are the partners, who are the clear partners, who are able not only to sit around the table and talk, but who also hold territory on the ground and are able to concede power both at the table but also on the ground.
And of course that will be raised in Geneva III, and we will come to that a little more later in the discussion. First of all, Marwan, I want to bring you in, because as a Syrian, do you favour this idea of federalism, or call it what you will, let's just say the division up of Syria?
Well, I think most Syrians, I would say, believe that federalism might be the first step towards partition. And it might be, as Maha has just said, it might be a recipe for a disaster in the country. And I think if the Syrian people are allowed actually to express their opinion on federalism, I think most of them actually would say no. And I don't think that federalism is the only solution to this crisis, because if we keep Syria one united country and then we have a democratic government where everybody can express itself and elect its own representative government, I think that would be the best solution, I mean, to this whole conflict. And I think if the Syrians during the Geneva talks agree actually to this, the transitional government or the body, I think that might make things easy to move into that direction. But I think the very idea of federalism, because here also it depends very much on what you mean by federalism. If you mean that if you are going to give more authority more power to local authorities here and there, I think most people would agree to that. But federalism is something that most people would be skeptical about, because people have been talking about this even in Iraq, and I think when they think of it, actually, especially when Joe Biden actually suggested that a few years ago, they would think that maybe, I mean, we are going towards partition rather than keeping the country as one unit and integrated. Okay,
Julien, when you talk to people about this idea, how would you calm fears that this doesn't mean the partition, the absolute division of the country?
There's two issues there. One is that obviously the ideal solution would be a unitary transitional government, some kind of democratic movement forward. But the reality on the ground is that there is going to be no agreement in Geneva over that. Assad is not going to budge, and the opposition are going going to continue demanding that he be removed before they move forward. So that's not an option. I think the other scenario that we're facing down at the moment is a real prospect, therefore, that the country breaks apart. If you don't have some kind of political movement, some kind of improvement on the negotiating scene, it's very likely that the different parts will pull away from each other. So I think this idea of devolving power may actually be one of the few options that gives you a chance of still holding the country together. It creates some loose power-sharing model based on geographical facts on the ground rather than a kind of central power-sharing agreement that perhaps could be used to incentivize both the regime and the opposition to move forward in some kind of diplomatic push. I think it's going to have to be pushed by outsiders, but I really do think it perhaps offers one of the better opportunities to still keep the country together.
This is no longer a local conflict, to be honest. I mean, in Syria, this is a regional and international conflict, and it's not only what Assad believes and what the opposition believe, actually. It's what the Russians and the Americans actually agree at the end of the day. And I think what they have been doing over the past few weeks is trying actually to come about to a certain agreement, actually, and try to impose it on both sides of this divide. I think this is something that we should always keep in mind. I think this is something when the Russians, because the Russians and the Americans, actually, there is the issue of federalism. And this is, in my opinion, what makes it really, I mean, a risky business to talk about. I mean, if it's up to the Syrian people, I think they might have a different say. But this is what makes me really skeptical about the whole issue. It's very much now an American business, a Russian business, and the Syrians are not the most important party into this conflict.
A solution that's being imposed on the Syrians. Maha, what have we heard from the Russians, from the United States on this issue? Are they in favour of the idea?
Everybody's come out in favor of the idea in one form or the other, but it's a very I mean, all we've heard are very vague and unclear or ambiguous statements, simply that perhaps federalism is one way to go in looking at this. However, to come back to the point that Marwan was making, I think that it is a recipe. I mean, there's a big difference between talking about a federal system that is based on sectarian and ethnic considerations and that devolves power to current rebel groups. And again, we have to take into account how do we deal with places that are under Jabhat al-Nusra or under ISIS. And there's a big difference between talking about this kind of federal system and between acknowledging the need to move away from a centralized state system and giving more decision-making, autonomy over decision-making to local governments. I mean, if you look at certain areas that are no longer under regime control, local governance councils have emerged across Syria, and they've learned how to deal with their own needs, and they've been providing for their people or for the people under their areas. So there are different models of governance, if you like, in Syria that already exist that one can bring onto the table, but it's too early at this point. And there's a huge gap, a huge difference between talking about a federal system based on ethnic and sectarian identities and between the need to decentralize power to the local level, give more autonomy over decision-making. Another thing I'd like to say is there was a survey very recently about sectarianism in Syria, and what was astonishing is that the majority of Syrians, not astonishing perhaps, but surprising to many, is that the majority of Syrians came out in favor of a unitary, centralized state. They want a state that is based on the values of citizenship, where they are all treated equally. Granted, within the survey, you also see that there are lots of problems in terms of mutual fears and mutual concerns. We've seen population transfers, we've seen ethnic cleansing. This has been a very dirty war. Not that there's ever a clean war, but this has been particularly brutal. So, and you have 12 million, I mean, let's not forget, there are 12 million Syrians who are currently not in their homes. They've been either displaced, they're more than 4 million are refugees outside Syria, and another 7.6 or 7.7 million who are displaced within Syria. So it's a very complex situation to be just throwing out terms like, let's put federalism on the table as the magic pill that will just resolve all of this.
Julien, Maha's mentioned this a couple of times, this question of what would happen to those areas controlled by ISIL, by the Nusra Front. I mean, ISIL, of course, is displaying one of the most effective ways of regional authority. What would happen to those areas? How would you get rid of that government when it's so entrenched?
Well, I don't think anyone's thinking of the federalism or the decentralization to include those territories held by ISIS. I think it's quite clear that the international coalition, the actors on the ground, are going to keep on pushing back against ISIS. It's been in the same sense that they haven't been part of the ceasefire or any political agreement or talks up until now. That's going to continue to be the case. So the real dilemma is going to be how you separate those groups linked to Jabhat al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda branch in Syria, within the other areas of Syria from other more moderate-leaning rebel groups. And I think that's where it's going to be incredibly difficult, because the two of them are increasingly so deeply intertwined, particularly in the northwest of the country. So that is a real challenge, and in a sense the burden of responsibility will be on the opposition and will be on its regional backers to try and create those divisions, that space between. But that is not an easy problem to overcome, and I think it's very clear that ISIS in particular can by no means be part of any decentralized approach. The war against ISIS will continue whatever happens in terms of the broader political negotiations.
You know, Marwan, if we look back at history, Syria is no stranger to this idea, really, of slightly breaking up, if you want to call it that. I mean, under Ottoman rule, it was a collection of relatively autonomous provinces. They were diverse provinces, but it was only when the French came along that, of course, they made it more centralised. Could you not see a return to that kind of system?
Absolutely, and this is why people hate really hearing, I mean, this word coming from New York, London, Paris, and these capitals, because they think that this is another colonial design to divide the country even further, because most Syrians believe that this country has already been divided. In fact, I mean, when you talk about the Greater Syria into different countries, and when people now start talking about even dividing the divided, the already divided, I think that brings to the memory of Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, and this is why people feel really uneasy about the word federalism when they hear it coming actually from the mouth of John Kerry or Sergei Lavrov.
Let's move the discussion forward a bit. Geneva III starting on Monday. Do you think this issue is even, Maha, going to be raised tomorrow or this week, or are we starting to run before we can walk here?
I think we're starting to run before we can walk. I'm not sure it will be raised, frankly. I think it's far too early to raise something like this. You need to get to even an agreement that there will be a transitional government. And I don't quite see that the move is even going in that direction at this point.
Julien, what then do you think will be discussed at Geneva III?
I think the talks are almost doomed to failure, to be honest. I'm not quite sure what will be discussed, because the two parties have such conflicting ambitions about what needs to be the outcome. The opposition, as I said, are intent on seeing Assad his departure set. The regime obviously has very different ambitions. So I think there's a huge mistake being made if the sense that of the attempts to maintain the ceasefire, to move any political process forward, are almost being put on the shoulders of these talks that are so clearly going to struggle. I think if there is going to be some move on the political front, if there is going to be some move towards decentralization, which perhaps can create the kind of institutionalization of the ceasefire that could then allow the Syrian talks to actually move forward, I really think that sadly, and no one wants this, but sadly this is going to have to be imposed by the external players on the domestic parties.
Marwan, what do you make of that?
Well, I think for me, as I said before, this is no longer a local conflict in Syria, and I think the regional and international powers, they have a great influence over the local parties to this conflict. And I think if the regional and international powers, they agree actually to push the parties, I mean, towards a solution, I think they can make progress. But maybe it's too early to expect any tangible results, but also it's too early to call it a failure.
So you don't think that they are doomed to failure, like Julien
No, I don't think so. I think the Russians, they want now, after they actually become the real power broker in the country, after their military intervention, I think they are desperate to make the point that they can actually hold the key to solving the Syrian crisis. And this is what they have been actually trying to convince the Americans. And I think the Americans, they bought this argument to an extent, in my opinion.
OK. Maha, there's one group, isn't there, that's, again, missing from these talks, the Kurds. They're pretty key in this conflict. They hold huge parts of northern Syria. Why are they not at the table?
Well, for a number of reasons. I mean, putting them at the table would upset Turkey for once. And it will just, I mean, it will basically mix the whole possibility of moving forward on the talks amongst the different trouble groups. So, I mean, again, I agree with your guest that the possibility of having, Julien, with the possibility of these talks moving forward at this point are really almost nil. However, I do think that Russia is very interested in showing some, I mean, for the Russians already, they've made quite a considerable gain. It's now become a joint operation between them and the US. So they are interested in beginning to show some political moves or some political gains out of these talks. However, I don't think we will see it happen in this particular round.
OK. I mean, Julien, the big stumbling block always has been the fate of Assad. How much leverage do the Russians have over the Syrian president?
Well, I think they have a considerable amount of leverage, but they're not prepared to use that to see Assad gone. Assad is a symbol of the investment that they've made in Syria. If he was to be pushed out by them, they would be seen in some senses as a Western success. The Russians have said that they will consider the question of Assad, but down the line, and I think they're very clear that for the moment, he has to be part of any political process. But as the other guests have said, the Russians do have significant interest in Syria today. They've exerted leverage in terms of the ceasefire that we've seen, which has been quite remarkable in terms of an 80% or so decrease in violence. That has very much been imposed on Assad. Assad didn't want that. He wanted to push on with the military fight, thinking that he could win it with Russian backing. So I think we have seen the Russians deploying their influence, and it can now be deployed in other political means. And I think the Russians are looking for some kind of political solution, of which something like decentralization might suit their needs.
Marwan, Assad remaining part of the political process, do you think most Syrians are coming round to that idea?
No, I don't think so. I mean, if this crisis is actually to come to an end, I think Assad must leave at a certain point in the future, because there will be no stability in this country. I mean, don't forget, more than 400,000 people have already been killed, and this regime, the head of this regime, is mainly responsible for that. So I don't think stability will come to Syria as long as this man is in power. I think he must go at a certain point in the future.
But the question
Everybody
is when,
knows that.
Isn't it? When is he going to go?
I think we have now resolution 2254, which says actually that we should have elections in 18 months after the formation of a government, of a unity government in Syria. I think that is the span of his political life, if everything goes according to plan. That is my opinion.
But of course, Maha, we had the Syrian foreign minister saying we refuse to even talk about presidential elections at these talks.
Absolutely, and I think, I mean, I agree with Marwan. President Assad has to go at some point. I mean, this man is responsible for what the country has, what has happened to his country over the past 5 years. And if you want to rebuild the country, you cannot rebuild it on blood and stone. I'm sorry. I mean, if he remains in power, a large number of the Syrian, I mean, half the population almost is now outside of Syria. A majority of this population may not go back if they are worried that they're still going to be targeted. So I just can't see that we're going to have a lasting peace with him staying in power. We're creating a scenario similar to the Yemen scenario, where maintaining Ali Abdullah Saleh in power, or at least he was removed from power, but allowed to continue with his political career, if you like, has gotten to the point where now Yemen is in the midst of a war. He's going to continue doing what he can to consolidate his own base. And this will not be in favor of a peaceful transition of power. It will not be in favor of maintaining a peaceful and unified Syria. It's just impossible. It's too, they just don't come together.
So not much optimism, it seems, for this round of the Geneva talks. We'll, of course, be keeping an eye on them as they unfold this week. Many thanks to all our guests for joining us here in this discussion today. Marwan, Kabalan, Maha, Yahya and Julien Barnes-Dacey. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, just go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter, our handle @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, bye for now.